In the spring of 2024, on the derelict grounds of the old Northgate facility, the demolition proceeded on schedule. But the sound that morning was wrong. The teeth of the excavator's bucket didn't scrape against stone. They punched through a thin shell of modern concrete with a hollow crack, revealing a dark circular moor where solid ground should have been. The foreman, peering into the blackness, saw what decades of silence had concealed. Two figures, side by side, perfectly preserved in the cool, still air of the well. They were dressed in bizarre, self-made suits of blue industrial tarpaulin. At that moment, the official story of two escaped patients was shattered. The 20-year-old cold case file on the disappearance of David and Samuel Miller, who vanished in 2004, was officially exhumed. October 11th, 2004. Inside the sterile beige walls of Northgate, life for David and Samuel Miller was anything but normal, yet it had its own meticulous rhythm. At 30 years old, the identical twins moved as a single unit, their shared psychosis a private world understood only by them. They didn't see themselves as patients, they saw themselves as engineers on the verge of a breakthrough. Their shared project, which they called the conduction shell, was taking shape in the facility's designated arts and crafts room. To the staff, it was a harmless, if obsessive, therapeutic exercise. Rolls of industrial-grade blue tarpaulin, spools of copper wire, soldering irons, all materials approved and provided by the facility's forward-thinking administrator, Dr. Alan Reed. He had championed their case, arguing that allowing the brothers to build their delusion was the most effective way to engage with it. He would observe them for hours, his expression one of deep academic interest as they painstakingly wove a fine copper mesh into the lining of the tarpaulin suits. The brothers spoke of their work with a calm, unnerving certainty. They were preparing for what they called the transmission. They believed a signal, a message from an unknown source, was imminent. Their charts and notebooks, filled with complex diagrams and celestial calculations, were not the ravings of madmen to them, but blueprints for a journey. Their final preparations were conducted not with frenzy, but with the quiet focus of astronauts before a launch. The last official sighting was by a night orderly during his 2 a.m. rounds. He noted in his log that the brothers were sitting on the edge of their beds, fully dressed in their strange blue creations. They weren't agitated. They were perfectly still, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. The orderly saw nothing unusual. In the surreal ecosystem of Northgate, this was just another Tuesday. The next morning, the silence in room 212 was absolute. During the 6 a.m. bed check, a nurse found the room empty. The beds were made. Their few personal belongings were neatly arranged. The window was locked from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry on the door. David and Samuel Miller were simply gone. It was a clean, silent, and seemingly impossible vanishing. Detective Maria Flores of the Cook County Sheriff's Office arrived as the sun climbed over the skeletal remains of the Northgate facility. The scene was a quiet hub of methodical activity, cordoned off from the demolition crew by a perimeter of yellow tape. The air smelled of dust and damp earth. Flores's focus was the well, a perfect circle of black against the grey rubble. It was not a primitive stone structure, but a deep bore shaft, its sides smooth and modern. The concrete cap, now in shattered pieces, was revealed to be a clever facade, barely 10 inches thick and reinforced with commercial rebar, not the solid multi-foot plug described in municipal records. The recovery was a delicate vertical operation. 2 forensic technicians, harnessed and lowered into the shaft, worked under portable floodlights. The bodies of David and Samuel Miller were remarkably preserved by the cool, stable environment. They were lifted out with extreme care, their blue tarpaulin suits stiff but intact. On the surface, the initial examination began. The cause of death was not immediately obvious. There were no broken bones, no fractures consistent with a fall from a significant height. The coroner on site noted a distinct lack of physical trauma. Toxicology was expedited. The suits themselves became the first exhibit. They were not random assemblages of junk, but meticulously constructed garments. The seams were sealed with industrial adhesive, the joints surprisingly articulated. When the technicians carefully cut one open, they found the detail that shifted the entire investigation from a tragic mystery to a criminal puzzle. The inner surface of the tarpaulin was lined with a fine, hand-woven copper mesh, a makeshift Faraday cage. This was not the work of unfocused minds. It was an attempt to block an electronic signal. Then came the second discovery from the well's depths. Alongside the bodies lay a heavy-duty, water-damaged metal toolbox. It was sealed shut, not with a lock, but with silicone caulk that had been carefully applied around its entire seam. It was a time capsule within a time capsule. Detective Flores stood back, observing the pieces laid out before her. Two men who vanished in 2004, a well that was officially sealed in 1998. Bodies with no signs of violence, dressed in suits designed to block electromagnetic frequencies. This was not an escape. This was not a suicide pact. The sheer logistical complexity, the fake concrete cap, the moving of two grown men, the sealing of the well, pointed to a carefully orchestrated event, a disposal. The first key questions hung in the air, cold and sharp. Who had the knowledge and materials to fabricate a concrete seal and falsify public records? Why were the brothers sedated, as the lack of injuries suggested, before being placed in the well? And most importantly, what was inside that sealed metal box? The investigation was no longer about finding the Miller brothers. It was about uncovering the sophisticated deception that had hidden them for 20 years. To understand how the truth remained buried for 20 years, one must look at the original 2004 investigation. It was not so much an investigation as it was a series of administrative procedures. The report, filed by the Chicago Police Department, shows that the inquiry into the Millers' disappearance was closed in less than 72 hours. The official cause was categorized as a voluntary patient abscondment. The search was brief, covering only the immediate hospital grounds, and concluding that the brothers had likely slipped into the anonymous sprawl of the city's industrial outskirts. The key to this swift and deeply flawed conclusion was one man, Dr. Alan Reed. As Northgate's chief administrator, he was the primary and most credible witness. His testimony, given with an air of professional regret, was instrumental in shaping the official narrative. He described the twins' conduction shell delusion as having reached its apex. He presented their disappearance not as a security failure, but as the inevitable tragic outcome of their psychosis, a final, desperate attempt to meet their imagined transmission. He painted a convincing picture of two men who did not want to be found. With the benefit of hindsight, the gaps in this narrative are glaring. The investigation never properly addressed the impossibility of an unassisted escape from a locked room. It never questioned the absence of any sightings, any use of bank accounts, any contact with the outside world. The police deferred to the expertise of the doctor. In the face of Dr. Reed's calm, authoritative certainty, the strange details were smoothed over, filed away as the unpredictable behavior of the mentally ill. Dr. Reed was more than just a psychiatrist. He was a respected figure in the medical community, a published author on delusional disorders. His reputation acted as a shield, deflecting any serious scrutiny of his facility. Northgate, under his leadership, was considered a model of progressive psychiatric care. The disappearance of two patients was a potential embarrassment, and the story of a well-planned escape was far more palatable to the board of directors and the public than any alternative. The decision to close the case was therefore not merely an act of negligence, it was a form of institutional complicity. The police department, burdened with a high volume of violent crime, accepted the simplest explanation. The facility's administration was eager to avoid a scandal, and Dr. Alan Reed, the architect of the official story, provided a narrative that conveniently served everyone's interests. The silence that fell over the Miller case in 2004 was not an accident. It was a consensus. It was a wall built of professional deference and bureaucratic convenience that stood for 2 decades. Detective Flores began the painstaking work of breathing life back into a 20-year-old case. This meant tracking down the ghosts of Northgate, the former staff now scattered across the country, their memories softened by time. The nurses, now in their 60s and 70s, remembered the Miller twins with a mix of pity and fear. They recalled their unnerving stillness, their quiet, collaborative work on the blue suits, and the imposing, ever-present figure of Dr. Reed, who managed the brothers' case with a proprietary zeal. But they offered no clues, only faded impressions of a tragedy they had been encouraged to forget. The search for the groundskeeper who had been on duty in 2004, Frank Kowalski, was more difficult. He wasn't in Illinois. Flores's team eventually located him in a small coastal town in Florida, living on a modest pension. When 2 deputies approached him, Kowalski was wary, his answers clipped. He claimed to remember the escape, but not the brothers themselves. He was just a man who cut the grass and fixed the pipes. His memory was a locked room, and he had no intention of handing over the key. The fear in his eyes was 20 years old, but it was still sharp. Frustrated by the fallibility of human memory, Flores turned to a more reliable witness, the Northgate Administrative Archive. Truckloads of paper records had been sent to a county storage facility when the institution closed. For weeks, Flores and her small team worked under the hum of fluorescent lights, sifting through a mountain of paper. They examined employee time cards, supply requisitions, patient transfer forms, and maintenance logs, building a map of the facility's daily life. Most of it was bureaucratic noise. But slowly, patterns began to emerge. They cross-referenced every purchase order for materials that could have been used to construct the fake well cap. They found several requisitions for high-strength concrete mix and rebar in late 2004, all filed under General Grounds Maintenance and all personally approved by Dr. Reed. It was unusual for the chief administrator to sign off on such mundane purchases, a task normally left to the head of maintenance. The real discovery came when Flores pushed her search back further to 1998, the year the well was officially sealed. She found the municipal work order in the county records, a clean, official document stating that Shaft 7 on the Northgate property was filled with 20 tons of earth and capped with a standard concrete seal. Frank Kowalski's signature was at the bottom, certifying the completion of the work. On its own, it meant nothing. But then, deep in Northgate's own payroll archives, Flores found Kowalski's overtime slips for that exact week in 1998. He had been paid for 40 hours of overtime, a substantial sum. The work description, however, did not mention overseeing a municipal well-filling project. It read, "Emergency septic line excavation, West Sector." The West Sector was nearly a half-mile from the well's location, and the signature authorizing the payment wasn't from the maintenance department. It was the precise, academic scrawl of Dr. Alan Reed. Why was the chief psychiatrist personally approving a groundskeeper's plumbing overtime for a job that, geographically, he couldn't have been doing? For the first time, Flores had a tangible link, however strange, connecting Reed and Kowalski to the well 6 years before the Miller brothers ever disappeared. The water-damaged toolbox, once pried open, yielded its secrets. Inside, amidst moldy notebooks filled with intricate wiring diagrams, was the source of the new theory. The pages were covered in what appeared to be star charts, but they were not astronomical. They were astrological, esoteric, filled with hand-drawn symbols and notations referencing alignments and conjunctions. This discovery, combined with the brothers' talk of a transmission and their bizarre, almost ceremonial blue suits, pointed the investigation in a new direction. Detective Flores began to entertain a compelling, if unsettling, hypothesis. The Miller brothers were not acting alone. Their shared delusional disorder would have made them incredibly susceptible to outside influence. The investigation shifted its focus to the fringe subcultures of the early 2000s. Flores's team delved into archives, searching for local doomsday cults, UFO sects, and New Age communes that were active in the Chicago area at the time. The theory was that a charismatic leader had latched onto the twins' unique psychosis, incorporating them into a belief system that promised ascension or a journey to another world. The conduction shells were not for blocking a signal, but for receiving one. The disappearance was a ritual. For a time, this theory held. It explained the meticulous preparation, the celestial alignments in the notebooks, and the seeming tranquility of their final moments. The investigators even identified a person of interest, the leader of a small, defunct group called the Etherian Gate, a man who preached about escaping this terrestrial shell and who had vanished without a trace in late 2004. It seemed all the pieces were finally fitting together. The official narrative was taking shape. David and Samuel Miller were the victims of a manipulative cult, culminating in a tragic, ritualistic suicide pact. Then the full toxicology report came back from the lab. The initial screen had been inconclusive, but the detailed analysis was definitive. The brothers' systems contained not only high levels of pentobarbital, a powerful sedative, but also traces of pancuronium bromide. It was a substance Flores knew well from other cases. It is a muscle relaxant, a paralytic agent used in surgery to prevent any movement. A person under its effects is conscious, but completely unable to move a single muscle. They cannot walk, they cannot speak, they cannot even blink. The cult theory shattered in an instant. A person cannot willingly participate in a ritual suicide if they are chemically paralyzed. They cannot climb down into a well. The Miller brothers had not walked to their final resting place. They had been carried. This was not a suicide. It was a cold, clinical, and meticulously planned execution. With the cult theory debunked, Detective Flores was left with a collection of cold, disconnected facts. Paralytic drugs, a Faraday cage-like suit, and a sealed well. The final piece of evidence lay on her desk, sealed in an evidence bag. The cassette tape recovered from the toolbox. The small, battery-powered recorder had miraculously protected its contents. The 20-minute audio was a chilling artifact, a monologue from the edge of oblivion. David and Samuel's voices were calm, describing their final preparations for the transmission, followed by a low, rhythmic humming that slowly escalated in frequency before a final, sharp click. It was considered the last testament to their shared delusion. But Flores wondered if they had missed something. The tape was sent to a specialized audio forensics lab in Quantico. For days, technicians subjected the recording to digital spectrum analysis, filtering out the hiss of the cheap tape and the ambient noise of the well. They isolated the brothers' voices and the dominant, oscillating hum. Then, they began to peel back the layers of sound, amplifying the frequencies that were almost imperceptible to the human ear. They were searching for a ghost in the machine. The report they sent back to Cook County was the turning point of the entire investigation. Behind the primary sounds, buried deep in the audio mix, was another noise. It was faint, rhythmic, and distinctly mechanical, the quiet, metronomic click and whir of a medical infusion pump. It was a sound that had no place in a story about a mystical transmission. It was the sound of a hospital room, a sound of clinical procedure. This single, anachronistic detail sent Flores back to the Northgate archives with a new and specific purpose. She was no longer looking for maintenance records or purchase orders for concrete. She was hunting for medical equipment. She pulled the inventory logs from the facility's experimental research wing, a department personally overseen by Dr. Alan Reed. Page after page revealed nothing, just the standard accounting of centrifuges and monitoring equipment. Then she found it. An entry dated September 28, 2004, just 2 weeks before the brothers vanished. It was a special dispensation form allowing for the removal of equipment for off-site research. The list was short. Item 1, one experimental sonic resonance generator. Item 2, 3 medflow infusion pumps. The purpose of the research was listed as private study. The equipment was never logged as returned. In that moment, 20 years of lies evaporated. The scattered pieces of the puzzle slammed together into a single, terrifying picture. The brothers weren't building suits to receive a message from the stars. They were trying to block a signal being generated within the facility itself. The paralytic drugs weren't a mystery. They were administered through the infusion pumps. The transmission they heard on the tape wasn't a delusion. It was the sound of Dr. Reed's sonic generator. This was never about madness. It was about a monstrous, unsanctioned human experiment. The doctor wasn't observing a psychosis. He was creating one. Based on the evidence, the final hours of the Miller brothers can now be reconstructed. The operation began not with violence, but with deception, cloaked in the guise of medical care. On the night of October 11, 2004, Dr. Alan Reed informed David and Samuel that the final phase of their preparations had arrived. This wasn't an abduction. In their minds, it was the culmination of their life's work. Reed, their trusted guide, led them to a secluded research lab in the facility's basement. There, he administered the sedatives, likely presented as a necessary step to calibrate them for the coming transmission. The infusion pumps, those same pumps signed out of inventory, would have done their work silently and efficiently. As the pentobarbital took hold, the brothers would have felt a growing drowsiness, a peaceful descent into unconsciousness. Once they were incapacitated, the pancuronium bromide was introduced. They were now completely paralyzed, their bodies inert, their minds trapped. The next step required an accomplice. Frank Kowalski, the groundskeeper, met Reed at the lab. Together, they loaded the unconscious but living brothers onto a utility cart, covering them with a canvas tarp. Under the cover of darkness, they navigated the quiet, sleeping grounds of Northgate, heading for the pre-prepared site at the old well, the well that, on paper, no longer existed. Kowalski had already staged the equipment, a winch, ropes, and the heavy metal toolbox containing the brothers' notebooks and the small cassette recorder. One by one, the brothers were carefully lowered into the dark, cold shaft. They were not thrown. Their bodies bore no signs of a fall. They were placed side by side at the bottom of the well. Reed then activated the small cassette recorder and placed it in the toolbox. The recording had been made earlier, a final, cynical piece of manufactured evidence to support the story of a willing journey into the unknown. The toolbox was sealed and lowered into the well with them. The final act of the cover-up was the most audacious. Using pre-mixed concrete and rebar, Reed and Kowalski spent the next few hours constructing the fake cap over the mouth of the well. It was a piece of engineering designed to deceive any casual observer, to blend in with the surrounding concrete pads and foundations of the derelict grounds. As the sun began to rise, they cleaned the site, removing all traces of their night's work. Dr. Reed returned to his office to prepare his statement for the police, while Frank Kowalski simply clocked in for his morning shift. In the cold, silent darkness 60 feet below, David and Samuel Miller's lives ended, their final resting place sealed away under a lie of reinforced concrete. Armed with a search warrant and the full weight of 20 years of buried evidence, Detective Flores's team arrived at the suburban Chicago home of Dr. Alan Reed. The man they found was a frail 78-year-old, his once sharp mind clouded by the fog of advanced dementia. His study, however, was a perfect archive of his former self. In a locked filing cabinet, they found his private journals. The entries, written in a precise academic hand, detailed the entire experiment. He never used the Millers' names, referring to them only as Subject D and Subject S. He documented his use of low-frequency resonance to induce auditory hallucinations, meticulously noting the brothers' escalating paranoia and their construction of the conduction shells as a resounding success for his fringe theory. The final entry described their disposal as a necessary, if unfortunate, logistical failure. Dr. Reed was arrested. He showed no comprehension of the charges, his memories of the experiment lost to the same cognitive decay he had once studied in others. He was deemed unfit to stand trial. In a final grim irony, the state remanded him to a secure medical facility where he would live out his remaining days as a patient, not a doctor. Frank Kowalski's confession came more easily. Tracked down at his quiet home in Florida, the now elderly groundskeeper broke down almost immediately. He recounted the events of that night in 2004, his testimony corroborating every detail of the investigation. He spoke of the heavy cash payments from Reed, money that had paid off his gambling debts and bought his silence for 20 years. In exchange for his full cooperation, Kowalski pleaded guilty to conspiracy and the improper disposal of human remains, receiving a reduced sentence that, given his age, was effectively a life term. The news of the resolution sent a shockwave through the medical community and the few surviving relatives of the Miller family. The story was not one of madness, but of monstrous abuse, a betrayal of the most sacred trust between a doctor and his patients. Justice had been served, but it was a cold, hollow victory. The verdict could expose the truth and punish the guilty, but it could not rewind time. It could not undo the 20 years of silence or heal the wounds inflicted by a man who had used his power not to cure, but to create monsters in the dark. Today, the Northgate Secure Psychiatric Facility exists only in photographs and sealed legal documents. The demolition was completed. In its place now stands a sterile and anonymous corporate park, a collection of glass and steel buildings with manicured lawns and neatly painted parking spaces. Progress has paved over the past, erasing the physical scars of the institution. The specific spot where the well once gaped open is now an unremarkable patch of green, indistinguishable from the rest of the landscape. The physical remnants of the case are stored in the climate-controlled quiet of the Cook County Evidence Archives. The two bizarre blue suits, the moldering notebooks, and the small cassette recorder have become objects of a dark fascination, studied by criminal profilers and forensic psychologists. They are artifacts from a story that serves as a chilling case study on the abuse of absolute power and the terrifying vulnerability of the human mind. In the end, the Miller brothers were given back their names. The official record was amended, their status changed from escaped patients to victims of homicide. The diagnosis of folie à deux remains, but it is now understood not as the cause of the tragedy, but as the tool. Their delusion was not a random affliction that led them to their deaths. It was a weakness, expertly identified and cruelly exploited by the very man entrusted with their care. The real horror of the Miller case was never a supernatural signal or a message from the stars. It was the methodical scientific corruption of a doctor's oath. Dr. Alan Reed didn't just cover up a crime, he orchestrated a symphony of madness, turning his patients' minds into his own private laboratory. The silence he imposed was not just the absence of sound, but the active suppression of truth. And today, people walk across that perfect lawn every day, their minds on deadlines and appointments, with no idea of the history 60 feet below. They feel the sun and the breeze, and they hear only the mundane sounds of the modern world. But the silence in that one spot is different. It is no longer empty. It rings with the frequency of a truth that waited 20 years to be heard.